I didn't confront them. I rebalanced. Section 1. The month. Everything looked stable from the outside. The city hummed with a predictable, rhythmic frequency that usually mirrored the steady growth of a well-managed index fund. I sat in my office on the 42nd floor, watching the digital ticker tape crawl across my monitors, but my mind wasn't on the volatility of the tech sector. My morning coffee had gone cold, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in the foundation of my life. On paper, everything was perfect. The spreadsheets balanced, the mortgage was ahead of schedule, and my reputation at the firm was solid. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at a high-performing stock just before a massive, unannounced sell-off. Was it paranoia, or was I finally seeing the cracks in the glass? Allison had been different lately, though different is a word used by people who don't pay attention to data points. She was efficient, polite, and strangely distant, like a software update that removed features you actually used while claiming to optimize the user experience. At dinner, the conversation was a series of closed-ended questions and rehearsed anecdotes about her day at the gallery. I watched her across the table, noticing how she checked her phone with a frequency that didn't match her social circle's typical activity. Why was she suddenly so interested in the logistics of my late nights at the office? I realized that the silence between us wasn't a sign of comfort anymore. It was a deliberate, tactical buffer. At the firm, the atmosphere had shifted from collaborative to competitive in a way that felt targeted rather than general. Grant Holloway, my senior, had started holding pre-meetings that I wasn't invited to, always citing a desire to save my time for more analytical tasks. I stayed silent because I knew that protesting would only confirm my loss of status to the rest of the floor. Victor Nolan, a junior peer with more ambition than actual insight, was suddenly very visible in Grant's inner circle. They whispered in the glass-walled conference rooms, their eyes darting toward my desk whenever I looked up from my projections. Was I being phased out, or was I being studied like a failing asset? Every morning I performed the same ritual. I checked the joint accounts, the shared calendar, and the internal project logs at the firm. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun yet. I was looking for a pattern, a deviation from the historical mean. Allison started mentioning Victor's name more often, usually in the context of someone who really understands the modern market landscape. It was a subtle jab at my disciplined, traditional approach to risk management, and I felt the social imbalance tipping against me. I didn't get angry, because anger is an emotional tax that I refuse to pay. Instead, I began to treat my personal and professional life as a portfolio that needed a deep clinical audit. The pressure began to mount when Grant asked me to hand over my proprietary modeling files to Victor for a routine peer review. I knew what that meant. They were looking to strip the value from my work while leaving the liability of the execution on my shoulders. I felt a cold realization settle in my chest as I uploaded the files. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a liquidation. That evening, I came home to find Allison dressed for a work event I hadn't been told about. She didn't look at me when she said she'd be late, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. I stayed in the dark living room long after she left, realizing that I was the only person in this house still playing by the old rules. I began to document every interaction, every missed meeting, and every suspicious transaction with the same precision I used for a high-stakes merger. My life was becoming a series of data points, and the trend line was pointing toward a total loss of influence. I watched as Victor started using my phrasing in client presentations, and I saw how Allison's smiles were now reserved for her phone screen. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was the quiet, suffocating realization that I was being replaced in real time by people I had helped build. Why was I still trying to save a system that had already decided I was obsolete? I chose to wait, to observe, and to let the market of their betrayal reach its peak. The psychological weight of being a ghost in my own life started to take its toll, but I forced myself to maintain the mask of the diligent analyst. I attended the dinners, I signed the documents, and I kissed Allison goodbye every morning like nothing was wrong. I was waiting for the moment when their confidence would turn into arrogance, because that is when the biggest mistakes are made. I realized that my silence was my greatest asset, a quiet room in which they could shout their intentions without even knowing it. How much longer could they keep up the charade before the truth became too heavy to hide? I knew the crash was coming, and I intended to be the only one who had hedged his bets. Late one Tuesday night, I found a small, handwritten note in the pocket of one of Allison's coats that she had left in the hallway. It wasn't a love letter, but a series of dates and times that corresponded perfectly with the pre-meetings Grant had been holding at the office. The realization hit me with the force of a market collapse. The betrayal at home and the betrayal at work weren't separate events. They were a coordinated acquisition. My partner and my protégé were working together to ensure my professional and personal bankruptcy. I sat on the floor of the closet, the cold air from the vent hitting my face, and I didn't feel sadness. I felt a strange, terrifying clarity. I realized then that my endurance wasn't just about survival, it was about gathering enough leverage to make the eventual exit meaningful. I had stayed silent because I needed to see how deep the rot went, and now I had the answer. The social threat was no longer a shadow, it was a clear, present danger that required a calculated, unemotional response. I stood up, replaced the note exactly where I found it, and walked back into the bedroom where the empty side of the bed felt like a premonition. That was the moment I understood that the man they thought they were cheating was already gone, replaced by a version of me they hadn't budgeted for. As the month came to a close, the external facade of my life remained perfectly intact, a beautiful monument to a dead relationship and a dying career. My colleagues still nodded at me in the hallways, and Allison still asked about my day with a scripted curiosity that I no longer found convincing. I was the captain of a sinking ship, but I was also the only one who knew where the lifeboats were hidden. I looked at the spreadsheets one last time before closing my laptop, seeing not just numbers, but the countdown to a very different kind of future. I wondered if they could feel the atmosphere changing, or if they were too blinded by their own perceived victory to see the trap I was about to set. Section 2. When affection starts tracking performance. In the world of finance, we talk about performance-based incentives, but I never expected my marriage to be governed by the same cold logic. Allison's affection had become a lagging indicator, something that only appeared when I provided a tangible benefit to her social standing or her comfort. If I secured a high-profile client, she was warm. If I mentioned a quiet week, she was a glacier. I began to track these fluctuations in a private ledger, noting how her love was essentially a commodity she traded for my labor. I stayed silent because I wanted to see if there was any residual value left in our history, or if I was simply holding a bag of worthless promises. The office environment had become a theater of the absurd, where Victor Nolan performed a caricatured version of my professional self. He wore the same style of suits, used the same analytical frameworks, and even mimicked my habit of pausing before answering a difficult question. Grant Holloway watched this performance with an approving smile, clearly believing he had found a more malleable and energetic version of me. I realized that my years of loyalty were being treated as a sunk cost, something to be written off as they moved toward a more aggressive, less ethical strategy. That was the moment I understood that in their eyes, I wasn't a partner. I was a resource to be harvested. I started noticing that Allison was becoming increasingly interested in my exit package and the non-compete clauses in my contract. She would ask leading questions over a glass of wine, her eyes searching mine for any sign of suspicion or weakness. I gave her nothing but the standard, scripted answers, watching as she mentally calculated the spoils of a potential divorce. It was a fascinating, albeit painful, exercise in human psychology. She was preparing to leave the sinking ship, but she wanted to make sure she took the gold from the vault first. How do you look at the person you loved and realize they are looking at you as a liquidation target? The pressure increased when Victor made a major mistake on a portfolio I had warned him about, but instead of taking responsibility, he and Grant attempted to shift the blame onto my outdated initial projections. I sat in the boardroom as they presented a distorted version of the facts, their voices calm and professional as they laid the groundwork for my termination. I stayed silent, my hands folded on the mahogany table, not offering a single correction or defense. I let them build their narrative, knowing that the more they lied now, the more devastating the truth would be later. I could feel the eyes of the other partners on me, some with pity, others with the cold indifference of the corporate world. I began to realize that my emotional neglect at home wasn't just a byproduct of my work, it was a weapon used to keep me off balance. If I felt insecure in my marriage, I would be more desperate to succeed at work, and if I was desperate, I was easier to manipulate. It was a closed-loop system designed to extract maximum effort while providing minimum security. I stayed silent because I was redesigning my life the way I redesign a failing portfolio. I was reducing my emotional exposure to people who no longer deserved my trust. Every time Allison gave me a hollow kiss, I mentally moved another asset into a private account she couldn't touch. The betrayal was confirmed when I saw a message on Allison's tablet that she had left unlocked. A message from Grant, not Victor. The pre-meetings at the office were actually pre-meetings with my wife, a collaboration to ensure that when I was fired, the settlement would be skewed in her favor. The level of coordination was impressive, a masterclass in strategic betrayal that would have been beautiful if it wasn't so predatory. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline, the kind you feel when a market crash finally happens and you realize you're the only one who bought the putts. I wasn't the victim of a random tragedy, I was the target of a hostile takeover. I spent the next week quietly moving my personal data, my intellectual property, and my private investments into structures they couldn't see or reach. I worked with Paul Henderson, a legal advisor who operated in the shadows and understood the nuances of invisible asset protection. I didn't tell him I was being betrayed. I told him I was rebalancing for a more volatile environment. He didn't ask questions, his silence matching my own as we built a digital fortress around my future. I watched Allison and Grant from a distance, seeing them as two predators who thought they had cornered a wounded animal, unaware that the animal had already left the cage. The social imbalance was now a chasm, with Victor publicly taking credit for my successful long-term hedges, while Grant quietly briefed the board on my recent decline in performance. I was being erased from the history of the firm I helped build, and the humiliation was supposed to break me. But instead of breaking, I felt a strange sense of liberation. If I had no reputation left to protect, I had no reason to follow their rules anymore. I continued to show up, to be polite, and to be the failing analyst they needed me to be. I was giving them exactly what they wanted, a sense of absolute, unearned security. One evening, Allison suggested we go away for a weekend to reconnect, a suggestion so transparently manipulative that I almost laughed. She wanted to keep me compliant and unsuspecting while the final legal papers were being drafted by Grant's lawyers. I agreed with a smile, even suggesting a luxury resort that I knew would be expensive and non-refundable. I watched the relief wash over her face, the predatory glint in her eyes softening into a false, practiced affection. I realized that she had stopped seeing me as a human being a long time ago. I was just a balance sheet to be optimized. As I sat in my office on the last Friday of the month, I watched Victor and Grant celebrating a big win in the break room, the sound of their laughter muffled by the glass walls. They looked so confident, so sure of their upcoming victory, that for a moment I almost felt sorry for them. They had built their entire plan on the assumption that I was the same man I had always been, predictable, loyal, and slow to react. They didn't realize that I had already timed my exit and that the value they were fighting over was about to disappear into thin air. I picked up my briefcase, checked my watch, and walked out of the office, leaving behind a version of my life that was already a ghost. Section 3. I noticed my ideas. Traveling without me. The Monday morning briefing was always a sterile affair, a cold exchange of data points and market sentiment, but today it felt like watching a play where everyone had a script except for me. I sat at the far end of the table, my notebook open but my pen idle, as Victor Nolan began his presentation on the new algorithmic hedge for the Emerging Markets Fund. As the first slide flickered onto the screen, I felt a sharp, icy jolt of recognition in my chest. There they were, the Monte Carlo simulations I had spent 6 months perfecting, the proprietary weighting variables I had derived from decades of historical data, all rebranded with Victor's aggressive font and color scheme. I realized that my intellectual property was no longer mine. It had been exported piece by piece, while I was busy maintaining the status quo of a dying career. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how far they were willing to go with the charade, watching as Grant Holloway nodded with a paternalistic pride that he had never shown toward my work. Did they think I wouldn't recognize my own logic, or did they simply believe I was too broken to care? Victor's voice was smooth, confident, and entirely devoid of the nuance required to actually execute the strategy he was pitching. He was selling the sizzle while I held the steak, but in this room, the sizzle was the only thing that mattered to the senior partners. I watched the numbers dance on the screen, seeing the subtle errors he had made in copying my work errors that would eventually lead to a significant, though not catastrophic, tracking error. The pressure in the room was palpable, a heavy, silent consensus that I was the past and Victor was the future. Every time Victor made a point using my data, he would glance at me with a mixture of pity and triumph, waiting for a challenge that never came. Why should I correct a man who was enthusiastically digging his own professional grave? I realized that by staying quiet, I was allowing them to over-leverage their competence in a system they didn't fully understand. I was the architect who knew where the structural weaknesses were hidden, and I was watching them build a penthouse on top of a cracked foundation. The social humiliation of being ignored was a small price to pay for the tactical advantage of being underestimated. Later that afternoon, I saw Samantha Reed, Allison's closest confidant, walking through the lobby with an air of purpose that seemed out of place for a casual visit. She didn't see me, but I saw the way she greeted Grant Holloway. A brief, familiar touch on the arm that spoke of a much deeper connection than professional courtesy. I stayed in the shadows of the glass elevator, my mind racing through the implications of this new data point. Was Samantha the bridge between the betrayal at home and the theft at the office? I realized then that my life wasn't just being dismantled, it was being auctioned off to the highest bidder in a market I hadn't even known was open. The internal monologue in my head had shifted from, "How do I fix this?" to, "How do I maximize the liquidation value?" I went back to my desk and began a quiet, forensic audit of my own files, noticing the digital fingerprints that Victor had left behind when he accessed my private drives. He hadn't just taken the finished reports, he had taken the raw data, the messy drafts, and the discarded theories. I stayed silent because I knew that if I complained to HR, they would see it as a desperate move by a fading star. Instead, I began to feed the system slightly altered data, nothing that would be flagged as a mistake, but enough to ensure that the outcomes Victor predicted would never materialize. I watched as the week progressed, the tension at the firm tightening like a coiled spring as the launch date for the new fund approached. Grant was under immense pressure from the board to deliver a transformative result, and he was betting everything on Victor's stolen and now subtly corrupted logic. I felt a cold sense of satisfaction as I realized that they were now dependent on me in a way they couldn't possibly understand. I was the silent partner in their inevitable failure, the one who held the keys to the exit, but had no intention of using them for anyone but himself. How long could they maintain this level of arrogance before the first signs of the tracking error began to surface? At home, Allison was increasingly occupied with gallery business that required her to be away for long stretches of the evening. I stayed silent when she returned, smelling of a perfume she didn't own and talking about a future that clearly didn't include our shared history. I realized that she was already mentally moved into her new life, treating our home as a temporary staging area for her eventual departure. I watched her move through the rooms like a ghost, her affection now a purely transactional currency used to keep me from asking the questions she wasn't ready to answer. Was she waiting for the settlement to be finalized, or was she waiting for me to be the one to break first? The rising psychological pressure was becoming almost physical, a weight on my chest that made every breath feel like a calculated risk. I began to spend more time with Paul Henderson, refining the exit strategy that would ensure my own financial and professional survival when the crash finally arrived. We worked in a small, nondescript office in the suburbs, far from the prying eyes of the city's financial elite. Paul was a man of few words, which I appreciated. He understood that in a crisis, information is the only true currency. He helped me set up a series of discretionary trusts and offshore structures that would be invisible to even the most aggressive divorce lawyers or corporate investigators. I realized that the month of stability had been a lie, a carefully constructed illusion designed to keep me compliant while the sharks circled. I stayed silent because I knew that any reaction would be used as evidence of my instability or emotional decline. I was being gaslit on a corporate and personal scale, and my only defense was a radical, unwavering commitment to the truth of the data. I began to see my life as a series of hedges, a complex web of protections that would allow me to walk away from the wreckage with my dignity and my wealth intact. Why was I still feeling a twinge of sadness for a woman who was actively planning my ruin? As the section ended, I received an internal memo announcing a reorganization of the research department, with Victor Nolan being promoted to a lead position that had previously been earmarked for me. I read the email 3 times, the words blurring on the screen as the finality of the betrayal settled into my bones. Grant had signed the memo with a flourish, a public declaration of my obsolescence. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched the sunset over the skyline, realizing that the shift had finally moved from the shadows into the light. I had been erased, but in that erasure, I found a terrifying kind of freedom. What would they do when they realized the man they had replaced was the only one who knew how to stop the bleeding? Section 4. Betrayal is subtle before it's profitable. The transition from suspicion to confirmation is a quiet one, a series of small, mundane realizations that eventually coalesce into a devastating whole. I sat in my home office, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my glasses, as I reviewed the digital trail that Paul Henderson had uncovered. It wasn't just a few meetings or a few stolen ideas. It was a systemic, multi-year plan to strip my assets and my reputation. I realized that betrayal isn't a sudden explosion. It's a slow, methodical leak that only becomes profitable when the vessel is nearly empty. Allison's spending had shifted into acquisition mode, with large, unexplained transfers to a law firm specializing in high-net-worth matrimonial disputes. I stayed silent because the numbers told a story far more compelling than any confession could ever be. I watched as the joint investment accounts were slowly rebalanced to favor liquid assets that could be easily moved or hidden. It was a masterclass in financial preparation, and I had to admire the cold efficiency of it. If I hadn't been the target, I might have even been impressed by the tactical execution. I realized that my emotional neglect hadn't been a cause of the rift, but a convenient narrative used to justify the theft. They needed me to be the villain so they could play the part of the victims, and I had played my role perfectly. At the firm, the profitability of the betrayal was starting to manifest in Victor's sudden rise in social status. He was now a regular at Grant's Country Club, a visible sign of his inclusion in the inner circle of power. I stayed silent when I saw the photos on social media, Victor holding a glass of scotch and laughing with the very men who were currently drafting my termination papers. I realized that status is as much a commodity as gold or oil, and Victor was trading my years of hard-earned credibility for a temporary seat at the table. How long before they realize that a seat at the table is worthless if you don't know how to cook? The pressure increased when Grant asked me to sign a confidentiality and non-disparagement agreement in exchange for a modest bonus and a consultant role for the next 6 months. It was a transparent attempt to buy my silence before the fund's performance inevitably started to diverge from Victor's projections. I stayed silent as I read the document, my eyes scanning the clauses that would effectively bar me from the industry for years. I realized that they weren't just looking to replace me, they were looking to bury me. I didn't sign it. Instead, I told Grant I needed to review it with my counsel, a move that I knew would trigger a frantic round of meetings between him and Allison. I began to notice that the subtle hints from my colleagues were becoming more overt, with whispers following me into the break room and quiet conversations ending abruptly when I entered. I was a dead man walking, a corporate ghost whose presence was an inconvenience to the new regime. I stayed silent because I knew that any outburst would only provide them with the emotional instability narrative they so desperately needed. I realized that my restraint was the only thing they didn't have a contingency for. They expected anger, they expected desperation, and they expected me to beg for my job. They didn't expect a calm, clinical observation of their own crimes. One evening, I found Allison in the kitchen, her laptop open and a look of intense focus on her face. She didn't hear me come in, and for a split second, I saw what she was looking at, a spreadsheet of our shared property with expected value and target settlement, columns clearly marked. I stayed silent as I watched her work, the person I had shared a bed with for a decade now, reduced to a predator calculating the weight of my bones. I realized that the love we had was never an asset. It was a liability that I had failed to hedge. I walked back out of the room, my footsteps silent on the hardwood, and went to the basement to call Paul Henderson. The psychological weight of living in a house of mirrors was starting to crack my composure, but I forced myself to lean into the discipline of the process. I began to move the counteroffensive into its final phase, ensuring that the corrupted data I had fed Victor would trigger a series of alerts once the market reached a specific volatility threshold. I realized that the most profitable betrayal is the one the victim never sees coming until it's too late to react. I stayed silent because I was now the one holding the short position on their collective futures. I was betting against their arrogance, and the odds were heavily in my favor. I watched as Victor and Grant held a victory dinner for the team, celebrating the successful launch of the fund using my stolen and sabotaged models. I stayed silent as I watched from across the restaurant, a ghost at the feast of my own destruction. I realized that their profit was built on a foundation of air, a temporary spike in value before the inevitable correction. I felt a strange, detached calm as I watched Allison walk into the restaurant and take a seat next to Grant, her hand lingering on his shoulder in a way that left no room for doubt. The betrayal was now fully visible, a public transaction that I was finally ready to settle. The rising pressure of the situation felt like the moments before a massive market opening, a mixture of anticipation and cold, calculated readiness. I had reduced my exposure to these people to zero. They no longer had any power to hurt me, only the power to make me richer in the eventual settlement. I realized that by saying nothing, I had allowed them to write their own confessions in the form of financial records and corporate emails. I stayed silent because the truth was a commodity that was about to become very, very expensive. How much would they be willing to pay to keep the world from seeing the rot behind their successful facade? As the section concluded, I sat in my darkened office at home, the silence of the house weighing heavy on the air. I looked at the exit button on my laptop, the final command that would initiate the legal and professional cascade I had spent the last month preparing. I realized that I didn't feel the need for revenge. I only felt the need for a clean break and a fair market value for my life. I stayed silent as I heard Allison's car pull into the driveway, her return marking the beginning of the end of our shared history. I hovered my finger over the key, the quiet realization of my own power finally reaching explicit clarity. Was I ready to pull the trigger, or was there one more data point I needed to collect before the exit was complete? Section 5. I reduced my exposure to people. The transition from being a participant in a life to being a clinical observer of one is a quiet, chilling process. I began to view my social interactions not as moments of connection, but as high-frequency trades where I was consistently losing value. Every dinner with Allison, every check-in from Samantha Reed, and every fake cordial greeting from Victor Nolan was a drain on my emotional capital. I stayed silent because I was busy de-risking my soul, systematically cutting the cords that allowed these people to influence my internal state. I realized that to win a game where the rules are rigged, you must first stop caring about the score the others are keeping. I started by auditing my digital footprint with a level of ruthlessness that would have made a forensic accountant blush. I moved my personal communications to encrypted servers, ghosted the social circles that were loyal to Grant Holloway, and stopped sharing any personal details with Allison. When she asked why I was being so withdrawn, I simply told her that the market volatility was demanding more of my focus. It was a half-truth, the best kind of lie in the corporate world. I watched her accept this explanation with a flick of her eyes, a sign that she was relieved she wouldn't have to perform the role of the supportive wife for much longer. The pressure at the firm was reaching a fever pitch as the board demanded a preliminary report on the Nolan Fund. Victor was walking around like a man who had already won the lottery, his arrogance growing in direct proportion to the amount of stolen data he was misinterpreting. I stayed silent when I saw him in the break room, his feet up on the table, talking loudly about disrupting the old guard. I realized that Victor didn't understand that disruption without discipline is just a fancy word for a catastrophe. He was a man holding a grenade and mistaking the ticking for a heartbeat, and I was the only one who had the pin. I began to spend my evenings in the city's public library or at nondescript coffee shops, places where no one knew my name or my title. I realized that my identity had been so tied to my exposure to these people, my job, my marriage, my status, that I had forgotten who the analyst was beneath the analysts. I stayed silent because the silence was the only place where I could think clearly without the interference of their expectations. I was reallocating my time into self-preservation, a commodity that was becoming increasingly rare in my world. How many of us are actually living our own lives? And how many of us are just executing a script written by people who want to profit from our labor? The psychological shift was profound. I no longer felt the sting of the humiliations they tried to heap upon me. When Grant forgot to include me in a high-stakes client call, I used the hour to finalize my offshore legal structures with Paul Henderson. When Allison spent the night at a friend's gallery opening without inviting me, I used the quiet of the house to back up the remaining evidence of the intellectual property theft. I was reducing my exposure to their toxicity by becoming a non-reactive surface. I realized that you cannot hurt a man who has already decided he is no longer there. I noticed that Samantha Reed was becoming increasingly aggressive in her concern for me, calling me to ask if I wanted to talk about things. It was a transparent attempt to gather intelligence for Allison's legal team, a social probe designed to find a crack in my armor. I stayed silent, giving her nothing but platitudes and vague assurances that I was managing. I realized that Samantha was a vital component of the Betrayal infrastructure, the emotional spy who validated Allison's choices while looking for ways to maximize the settlement. I watched her frustration grow with every non-committal answer I gave, a small but satisfying victory in a war of attrition. The social imbalance was now a feature of my life, not a bug, and I leaned into the isolation with a disciplined intensity. I stopped going to the gym where I used to see Grant, stopped eating at the restaurants where the firm's partners congregated, and stopped engaging with the work family that had already disowned me. I stayed silent because every word spoken to a traitor is a gift you cannot afford to give. I realized that by reducing my exposure to people, I was increasing my leverage. They could no longer predict my moves because they no longer knew my mind. Why do we fear loneliness when it is the only state that offers absolute security? The pressure from Allison for a serious talk was becoming a daily occurrence, her frustration boiling over as her timeline for the divorce was being disrupted by my lack of reaction. She wanted a fight, a scene, a moment of emotional instability. She could record or report to her lawyers. I stayed silent, offering her a calm, polite mask that drove her into a state of quiet, simmering rage. I realized that her power over me was entirely dependent on my emotional investment in her, and since I had fully liquidated that investment, she was effectively powerless. That was the moment I understood that the rebalancing was working. The person they were trying to destroy was already a ghost. I spent one final night in our shared home looking at the art on the walls and the furniture we had chosen together, and I felt absolutely nothing. It was like looking at a portfolio of stocks for a company that had already filed for bankruptcy. The symbols were familiar, but the value was zero. I stayed silent as I packed a small bag of essentials, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who has already checked out of his own life. I realized that the exit wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a spiritual necessity. I was ready to leave the wreckage behind, but I had to wait for the exact second the market would provide the maximum return on my departure. As the section closed, I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching Allison sleep, her phone glowing on the nightstand with a message from Grant. I felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity, the kind you get when you finally see the bottom of a deep, dark well. I stayed silent as I walked out of the house, the cool night air hitting my face like a promise. I realized that the shift was complete. I had moved all my assets, emotional and financial, into a space they couldn't reach. I looked at the clock on my phone, 3:30 a.m. The market was hours away from opening, and the tracking error in Victor's fund was about to become a public disaster. Would they realize it was me, or would they blame the ghost they thought they had created? Section 6. Timing matters more than emotion. The world of high finance is built on the illusion of control, but the only thing we truly control is the timing of our reactions. I sat in a small, quiet cafe 2 blocks from the firm, watching the morning sun hit the glass towers of the financial district. This was the day the preliminary performance numbers for the Nolan Fund were due to be presented to the executive committee. I stayed silent as I sipped my black coffee, knowing that the corrupted variables I had introduced into the model were about to trigger a systemic divergence. I realized that in life, as in the market, emotion is a distraction. The only thing that matters is the execution of the exit at the moment of peak leverage. I had spent the last 72 hours in a state of hyper-focused calm, working with Paul Henderson to ensure that the moment the firm's disaster became public, my legal and financial protections would be impenetrable. We had timed the filing of my constructive discharge claim and the intellectual property lawsuit to coincide exactly with the board meeting. I stayed silent when Paul asked if I was sure about the timing. He was a man of logic, but he didn't understand the poetic justice of a perfectly timed market correction. I realized that I wasn't just seeking a settlement. I was seeking a total recalibration of the power dynamic. The pressure at the office was invisible but absolute, a heavy tension that I could feel even from 2 blocks away. I knew that Victor would be frantically checking his monitors, trying to understand why his innovative hedge was suddenly bleeding capital in a stable market. I stayed silent as I imagined Grant's face when he realized that the outdated analyst he had pushed out was the only one who could have prevented the collapse. I realized that their arrogance was their biggest liability. They had assumed I was too defeated to fight back, never considering that I was too disciplined to fight early. Why rush a victory when you can wait for the opponent to defeat themselves? I walked into the firm at 9:30 a.m., sharp, the atmosphere inside like the moments before a storm. People were scurrying through the hallways, their voices hushed and their eyes wide with the kind of panic that only comes from a sudden loss of money. I stayed silent as I made my way to my desk, noticing that Victor's office door was slammed shut and Grant was nowhere to be seen. I realized that the tracking error had grown into a full-scale crisis, and the internal systems were already flagging the discrepancies I had planted. I felt a quiet, internal satisfaction that was far more powerful than any loud confrontation could ever be. The internal monologue in my head was a rhythmic chant: stay calm, stay silent, stay disciplined. I watched as the partners gathered in the glass conference room, their gestures animated and their faces pale as they looked at the performance charts. I stayed silent when a junior analyst asked me if I knew what was happening, simply shrugging my shoulders and returning to my screen. I realized that I was the only person in the room who wasn't panicking, a fact that made me more conspicuous than if I had been shouting. I was the eye of the hurricane, a calm center around which their world was rapidly disintegrating. At home, the timing was also reaching a critical point. Allison had sent me a text message demanding to meet for lunch to finalize our plans. I stayed silent as I read the message, knowing that her plans involved a coordinated legal strike that Grant's lawyers had prepared for her. I realized that she was about to find out that the assets she thought she was claiming had already been legally reallocated or shielded by the very structures Paul and I had built. I felt a surge of cold, clinical curiosity. How would she react when she realized that her promising future with Grant was built on the ruins of a firm that was currently imploding? The psychological pressure of the board meeting was mounting, the silence of the executive floor feeling like a vacuum that was sucking the air out of the building. I stayed silent as I received a frantic message from Grant asking me to come to the conference room immediately to discuss a data integrity issue. I realized that they had finally traced the source of the model's failure to the files Victor had stolen from me. They weren't calling me for my help. They were calling me to find a scapegoat for their own incompetence. I didn't go. Instead, I sent a one-line email to the entire board, including the link to my filed lawsuit and the evidence of the IP theft. I watched through the glass as Grant's phone buzzed on the conference table, and I saw the moment he read the email. His face went from pale to a ghostly white, his eyes darting toward my desk with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. I stayed silent as I stood up, packed my personal laptop, and began to walk toward the elevators. I realized that the timing was perfect. The board was now seeing the truth of the betrayal at the exact same moment they were seeing the financial cost of it. How does it feel to realize that the man you thought was your victim is actually your judge, jury, and executioner? The exit was complete, a clean break from a system that had become a parasite on my life. I stayed silent as the elevator doors closed, cutting off the sound of the chaos on the 42nd floor. I realized that I had achieved more through restraint and timing than I ever could have through anger or revenge. I had allowed them to reveal their true market value, which was zero, while I had preserved and protected my own. I walked out of the building and into the bright mid-morning light, feeling like a man who has just stepped out of a long, dark tunnel into a world he finally understands. As the section ended, I sat in my car and watched the news on my phone, a developing story about a major hedge fund facing a technical glitch that could cost millions. I stayed silent as I dialed Paul Henderson's number to tell him the plan was in motion. I realized that the power I felt wasn't the loud, boisterous power of Grant or Victor. It was the quiet, terrifying power of the man who knows how to wait. I looked at the building one last time, the realization of my victory settling into my bones with a heavy, satisfying weight. What would be left of their lives when the market closed today, and would they ever realize that I was the one who had rebalanced the scale? Section 7. They felt the shift without seeing it. The silence that followed my departure from the firm was the most expensive silence of Grant Holloway's career. I sat in a high-backed leather chair in Paul Henderson's private office, watching the city skyline bleed into a deep, bruised purple as the sun went down. My phone sat on the mahogany desk between us, vibrating with the frantic persistence of a dying pulse. Grant had called 12 times. Victor had texted 16. Allison had left 3 voicemails, her voice transitioning from calculated irritation to a thin, sharp edge of panic. I stayed silent because there is no conversation more powerful than the one you refuse to have. I realized that they weren't looking for an explanation. They were looking for a way to negotiate a reality that had already been locked in. The psychological pressure had shifted entirely onto them, a weight so heavy it was visible in the way the local financial news began to report on unexplained leadership transitions at the firm. I stayed silent because I knew that every minute they spent wondering where I was, they were losing the ability to control the narrative. I had given the board of directors everything: the logs, the metadata, the correspondence with Allison, and the proof that Victor's innovation was a stolen, sabotaged asset. I realized that my power wasn't in the attack, it was in the timing of the reveal. How long does it take for a person to realize that the ground beneath them isn't just shifting, but has completely vanished? I watched as the digital ripple effect of my exit began to dismantle their carefully constructed lies. By 4:30 p.m., a stop trading order had been placed on the fund, and by 5:30 p.m., the firm's internal security had escorted Victor Nolan from the building. I stayed silent as I viewed the grainy photo a former colleague sent me. Victor standing on the sidewalk with a cardboard box, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He hadn't just lost his promotion, he had lost his career, his reputation, and his leverage. I realized that his ambition had been his greatest weakness, a blind spot that allowed him to believe he was smarter than the man who had taught him everything. Why do the young always mistake a mentor's patience for a mentor's obsolescence? Allison's calls were different. They were the calls of a person who had realized her insurance policy was a counterfeit. She had spent months planning a liquidation of our marriage based on a future that was currently being erased in a series of emergency board meetings. I stayed silent because I knew that responding would only give her a sense of closure she didn't deserve yet. I realized that she had never truly known me. She had only known the version of me that was convenient for her lifestyle. That was the moment I understood that the rebalancing wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming the space in my mind that she had occupied like a squatter. How does it feel to realize that the person you were plotting against has already moved on to a life you aren't invited to? The atmosphere in Paul's office was clinical, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding 40 floors above the street. We reviewed the final draft of the settlement agreement, a document that would ensure my professional name was cleared and my financial interests were protected by a series of ironclad penalties. I stayed silent as I signed the last page, the scratch of the pen on the paper sounding like the final click of a lock. I realized that I had achieved a level of dominance that Grant and Victor could never understand, a dominance born of competence and restraint. They had tried to play a game of checkers with a man who was playing a game of systemic risk management. Why would I ever shout when the numbers already did the screaming for me? I stayed at a quiet hotel that night, the kind of place where the staff is paid for their discretion and the walls are thick enough to drown out the world. I stayed silent as I looked at myself in the mirror, noticing that the tension in my shoulders had vanished, replaced by a cold, steady resolve. I realized that the humiliation I had endured, the ignored emails, the missed meetings, the stolen credit, was just the cost of doing business. It was the entry fee for the life I was about to start, a life where my value would never again be determined by people who didn't understand the market. That was the moment I understood that true power isn't about being seen. It's about being the variable that no one accounted for. As the news of the firm's restructuring became the lead story on every financial site, I watched the comments section fill with speculation and blame. I stayed silent because the truth was already where it needed to be, in the hands of the people who could execute the consequences. I realized that Grant's career was over, not because I had sought revenge, but because he had prioritized his own ego over the integrity of the firm. He had bet on a fraud and lost, a classic market error that no amount of social standing could fix. I felt a quiet, detached pity for him, the kind you feel for a gambler who has finally hit the bottom of his credit. How many lives are ruined because people forget that excellence is a habit, not a performance? The rising psychological pressure on Allison must have been unbearable, a slow-motion realization that she was now tied to a sinking ship. She had aligned herself with Grant for status and security, only to find that she had traded her husband for a pariah. I stayed silent when she finally sent a text that simply said, "I'm sorry, Daniel." I realized that she wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry that she had been caught on the losing side of a bad trade. I didn't reply. Instead, I deleted the thread and blocked the number. That was the moment I understood that some assets are not just underperforming, they are toxic, and the only way to recover is to write them off entirely. The shift was complete, an invisible transformation that had turned me from a victim of corporate politics into the architect of a new reality. I stayed silent as I watched the morning light hit the city the next day, feeling a sense of peace that was almost alien to me. I realized that the moral victory wasn't about public gloating or loud revenge. It was about the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had stayed true to my principles while they had abandoned theirs. I had rebalanced my life, reduced my exposure to the small and the petty, and timed my exit with the precision of a master analyst. Why do we fear the end of things when the end is just the beginning of a better managed portfolio? As the section concluded, I received a final email from the firm's legal team, acknowledging the terms of my settlement and confirming that Grant and Victor had been separated from the company. I stayed silent as I closed my laptop, the screen going dark like the final curtain of a play. I realized that I was finally free, not just from the firm or the marriage, but from the need for their validation. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the tiny people on the street below scurrying toward their own deadlines and dramas. I felt a quiet, powerful sense of clarity. What does it look like when the person who was supposed to be destroyed is the only one left standing? Section 8. What power looks like after the exit is complete. The final meeting took place in a neutral conference room in a building I had never entered before, a space of glass and steel that felt as cold and efficient as my new perspective. I sat at the head of the table, my posture relaxed, but my focus absolute, waiting for Grant and Allison to arrive with their respective legal teams. I stayed silent because I wanted them to feel the weight of the room, the silence, a vacuum that they were forced to fill with their own discomfort. I realized that the man they were seeing now wasn't the man they had betrayed. It was the man they had inadvertently forged in the fire of their own greed. That was the moment I understood that my competence was a weapon they had no defense against. When they walked in, the social imbalance was so stark it was almost comical. Grant looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, his suit hanging off his frame and his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit that didn't exist. Allison followed him, her face a mask of practiced indifference that cracked the moment her eyes met mine. I stayed silent because I didn't need to speak to assert my authority. The documents spread out on the table spoke for me. I realized that they were looking at me with a mixture of fear and confusion, trying to find a trace of the disciplined analyst they thought they could control. They found nothing but a man who had moved on to a market they couldn't access. The settlement process was a series of quiet, clinical transactions that stripped away the last of their pretenses. Grant was forced to sign a full admission of fault regarding the intellectual property theft, a document that would ensure he could never work in a senior capacity in the industry again. I stayed silent as I watched him sign, his hand trembling slightly as the pen touched the paper. I realized that his silent dominance had been a hollow performance, a facade built on the labor of others. Now that the labor had been withdrawn and the truth revealed, there was nothing left but the wreckage of a mid-level talent who had overreached. Why do the mediocre always think that stealing a map is the same thing as knowing the terrain? Allison's portion of the meeting was even more restrained, a final audit of a marriage that had been bankrupt long before the papers were filed. She received the minimum settlement required by our pre-existing agreements, a fraction of what she had hoped to extract through her collaboration with Grant. I stayed silent when she tried to speak to me after the documents were signed, her voice a low whisper that sought some kind of emotional reconciliation. I realized that she was still trying to trade in a currency that I no longer accepted. That was the moment I understood that the greatest moral victory isn't forgiveness, it's the absolute, dignified removal of yourself from someone else's life. I watched them leave the building from the lobby. Two people whose lives had been irrevocably changed by a man they had tried to erase. I stayed silent as I walked out into the crisp afternoon air, the noise of the city sounding like a symphony of opportunities I was finally ready to explore. I realized that my rebalancing had been a complete success. I had exited the bad trades, protected the core assets, and positioned myself for a future of my own design. I felt a quiet, deep-seated satisfaction that wasn't about pride, but about clarity. I had proven that timing, discipline, and restraint are the only true sources of power in a world of loud, desperate people. The consequences of their actions continued to unfold naturally, without me having to lift a finger or utter a word of malice. Grant's reputation was a scorched earth, his name a warning to other firms about the dangers of unchecked ambition and ethical rot. Victor Nolan vanished from the industry entirely, a cautionary tale whispered in the elevators of the 42nd floor. I stayed silent when I heard that Allison had moved to a smaller city, her social standing in our former circles having collapsed under the weight of her own choices. I realized that I didn't feel happy about their misfortune. I simply felt the same way I feel when a failing stock finally hits zero. It was the only logical outcome. I spent the next several months traveling, not to escape, but to recalibrate my own sense of self outside the context of a career or a role. I stayed silent in the cathedrals of Europe, on the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, and in the quiet libraries of small towns. I realized that the emotional neglect I had been accused of was actually a hunger for a life that had more substance than the one I had been living. That was the moment I understood that the betrayal had been a gift, a painful but necessary market correction that forced me to liquidate a life I had outgrown. How much of our suffering is just the friction of staying in a place where we no longer belong? I eventually returned to the city, but on my own terms, opening a private consultancy that focused on the one thing I knew better than anyone: risk management. I stayed silent about my past, letting my results and my reputation for absolute integrity speak for me. I realized that I was no longer an analyst of numbers, but an analyst of character, choosing to work only with those who understood that value is built on trust, not optics. I felt a quiet satisfaction every morning when I walked into my new office, a space with no glass walls, no pre-meetings, and no ghosts. I had finally built a portfolio that was truly diversified, anchored by a deep, unwavering respect for my own worth. As the sun set on the final chapter of this transition, I sat on my balcony overlooking the river, a glass of water in my hand and a book on my lap. I stayed silent because there was nothing left to say, the narrative of the last year having reached its inevitable, dignified conclusion. I realized that power isn't about the noise you make or the revenge you take. It's about the silence you keep and the life you build after the world thinks you've lost. I looked out at the dark water, feeling the weight of the moral clarity I had earned through endurance and competence. I was the master of my own market, and for the first time in my life, the price of my peace was exactly what I was willing to pay. The story was finished, the rebalancing complete, and the exit final. I stayed silent as the last light faded from the sky, a quiet smile touching my lips as I realized that the man they had tried to destroy had actually been the one who saved himself. I had redesigned my life from the ground up, and the result was a structure that was as beautiful as it was unbreakable. I realized that I didn't need to know what happened next to them, because I finally knew what was happening next to me. That was the moment I understood that the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to take your life is to let them have the one they think you're living while you go off and build a better one. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.